She fled through a blizzard with nothing but her child and a secret worth dying for. He was a broken man, hiding from a world he no longer trusted. What happened when their paths crossed on the edge of winter changed everything. But what she didn't know was that the real storm hadn't even begun. Stay with us, because this story will shake your soul. The last time someone knocked on Elias McCrae's door, the world was still full of voices. That was years ago, before the fever came and took his wife and their newborn boy in the same week before the war, swallowed the land and spit out men like him, silent, shell-worn, and content to disappear into the edge of nowhere. He hadn't heard laughter in his home since, and that was fine by him. The house held its silence like a secret. Every floorboard creak was familiar, every gust of wind across the chimney a ghostly lullaby he had learned to live with. So, when he heard the sound not of a knock, but the faint brittle tap of knuckles against a frozen gate post, he nearly didn't believe it. For a moment he thought it might be the wind playing tricks like it often did across the hollow. But the tapping came again, firm and deliberate. Elias stood still on the porch of his ranch, squinting through the thin wall of frost that hung over Laramie Hollow like a veil. The air was bitter biting through even his wool coat. It was the kind of cold that could stop a man's breath mid-sentence. And yet there she was, a woman, on foot, carrying a child. She came walking up the dirt road like a ghost torn from somewhere else's nightmare. Thin, mud-streaked dress clinging to her legs, no coat, no gloves, just a mess of wind-tangled hair pinned up with trembling fingers. In her arms a bundle wrapped tight in tattered cloth. A child's foot peeked from the fabric, small bare purple with cold. Elias did not move. He watched her the way an old soldier watches a sudden shadow at the tree line, not with fear, but with that deep, bone-earned readiness that never fully leaves a man. Her steps were slow, like each one was borrowed from a body almost past its limit. She didn't cry, didn't plead. She reached the gate, steadied herself with one hand, and knocked again with the back of her knuckles. Then she waited. There was no desperation in her posture, just a tired defiance, the kind forged over miles of hard road and too many nights sleeping on frozen ground. She didn't look like a beggar. She looked like someone who had already lost more than she could afford, but was too proud to let it show. Elias finally descended the porch steps, boots crunching on snow-hardened earth. As he approached, she straightened though her knees looked ready to buckle. Her face was pale lips, cracked and chapped. A bruise marred her left cheekbone. Still, her gaze met his square. "I ain't here for pity," she said, voice dry and ragged like the wind itself. "But my little girl hasn't eaten in 2 days. I can work. I can scrub sew milk whatever you got. Just don't let her go hungry." Elias looked at the child. A girl, maybe 3 years old, her head resting against her mother's collarbone, too quiet to be sleeping well. Her arms dangled. Elias felt a cold creep into his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. The fever had made his boy look like that too. "What's your name?" he asked, surprised at how rough his voice sounded. "Clara Winslow. Her name's Rosie." He glanced at the road behind her. No tracks but her own, no wagon, no horse, just one set of weary prints trailing into the distance. "You walked here?" She nodded once. Elias weighed the silence like a scale. He didn't trust people, not anymore. But something in her tone, in the way she hadn't begged, hadn't wept, hadn't offered some sorry lie about being lost, made him pause. The kind of quiet she carried was the kind that came after storms, not before them. "You can sleep in the barn," he said at last. "It's dry and the hay's fresh." She didn't look grateful. She just nodded like the terms of a contract had been agreed upon. As if she'd been making trades like this her whole life. He opened the gate and she stepped through. The wind howled low through the trees like it was carrying old secrets. Elias led her through the snow-packed yard. He didn't offer to carry the child, he sensed she wouldn't allow it. But he lit the lantern at the barn door before she could ask. Inside, he showed her the cot in the corner, one he used himself during calving season. He fetched her a blanket, the thickest he had, and left a chipped bowl of boiled beans near the edge of the stall. She nodded again, said nothing, and slowly laid the child down. As he stepped out into the cold again, Elias paused at the threshold. He looked back. She'd knelt beside her daughter, brushing hair from her face. Her shoulders had slumped for the first time, not from defeat, but from the sheer weight of carrying on. As he shut the barn door, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that this woman hadn't simply stumbled onto his land. She had run here. Run from something dark enough to make a mother risk the wild and the cold. Run far enough to reach a forgotten corner of Wyoming where no one came unless they were lost or hiding. And Elias knew something else, too. Something he felt like a whisper in the marrow of his bones. Trouble was coming. Not in the way of thunder or gunfire, not yet, but the kind that starts with a soft knock on the wood and ends with a man deciding whether to open his door again, or finally lock it for good. He looked toward the hills, toward the road that vanished into the white. And for the first time in a long while he realized something might be stirring in him too. Not fear, not duty, something more dangerous. Hope. That night the cold deepened, settling over Laramie Hollow like a burial shroud. Inside the barn the wind whispered through the rafters, and the shadows moved like old memories too stubborn to fade. Clara didn't sleep much. Neither did Elias. He lay in his cabin, staring at the dark ceiling, thinking not of the woman in the barn, but of the way she hadn't asked for anything. Not really, just food for her child. A mother's request stripped down to its most primal form. At first light, Elias rose, brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and stepped outside. The frost bit harder than the day before. A thin layer of ice crusted the troughs. The barn stood silent under a veil of white. He pushed the door open gently. Clara was already up, huddled in a blanket, feeding Rosie with careful, practiced hands. The girl's eyes flickered open, dull but alive. Clara looked up, her expression unreadable. "There's oats on the stove," Elias said simply. She nodded, stood slowly. Her limp was worse in the morning light. Elias didn't comment. He didn't ask how long she'd been walking. He just watched her rise and gather her child like she'd done it 1,000 times in worse places. Later that morning, after Rosie had eaten and curled into the hay, Clara found Elias near the pump, fixing the handle that froze overnight. She didn't wait to be asked. She rolled up her sleeves and started clearing debris from the troughs. "You know how to handle livestock?" he asked after a while. "I've cleaned stalls, milked cows, patched wounds. I'll learn what I don't know," she replied. Elias gave a grunt that wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't dismissal either. He noticed her movements slow. Yes, but efficient. She didn't fumble, didn't pause for pity. There was a rhythm to her effort, like a person who'd survived long enough to understand time was a resource not to be wasted. By midday, she had scrubbed out the feed bins, swept the floor of the main stall, and repaired 2 rips in an old saddle blanket without being told. Elias brought out boiled potatoes and hard bread. They sat under the awning in silence, eating slowly. Finally, she spoke. "I won't be trouble. I just need a place." Elias took a long drink of water and wiped his hands on his coat. "Place comes with work. I don't run a charity." "That's fair. Your leg's worse than you let on." She looked down. "I twisted it saving her when our wagon broke outside Cheyenne. Didn't heal right." Elias didn't press. He didn't need the full story. He knew the kind of silence people carried when they were escaping something not just dangerous but familiar. Clara's eyes told him she wasn't new to fear. That evening, she sat by the barn's tiny stove, mending an old rope halter. Rosie slept nearby, curled in a borrowed quilt. Elias watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame arms, folded. "You ever think about leaving Wyoming?" she asked, without looking up. "I left enough places before this. Don't aim to run any more." She didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth twitched, maybe the closest she'd come to a smile since she arrived. As snow began to fall again, light but steady, Elias made a choice. He didn't say it aloud, he didn't announce it. But when he returned to the house that night, he laid out a second cup beside his own. Not because she'd asked, because he wanted to. The next morning brought more wind. Clara didn't complain. She rose early, fed the chickens, swept the porch without being told. Elias came out to find Rosie, wrapped in a scarf, giggling softly at the snowflakes landing on her hand. It was the first sound of laughter he'd heard in years. He paused, something catching in his chest. Not grief, something older. Hope, maybe, or guilt. The kind of feeling that makes a man remember what he lost. Later, as the fire crackled in the stove, Clara spoke softly, her hands busy at the washboard. "I had a husband, not much of one. He sold our mule for whiskey, said Rosie was just another mouth he didn't ask for." Elias said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between them had become something that didn't always require filling. By week's end, she moved slower, her limp worsening. Elias brought a tin of salve and a warm rag. She looked at him, wary. "Let me help." She allowed it, barely. As he wrapped her ankle, he saw the bruises older than the journey. "You've been running a long time." She nodded. "Long enough I forgot what standing still feels like." He tightened the bandage gently. "Well, maybe it's time you learned again." Outside, the snow piled slowly against the gate. Inside, the barn glowed with a soft, borrowed warmth. Not comfort, not yet, but the kind of quiet that comes before roots settle into the ground. Clara watched Elias pack away the bandages, her expression unreadable. Then, as if deciding something important, she said, "If you want me gone, say it straight, but if you don't treat me like I'm halfway out the door." Elias paused, looked her square in the eyes. "You're not," and that was that. No contracts, no promises. Just a quiet agreement made between two people who knew that sometimes survival wasn't about fleeing storms, but learning how to stand still long enough to let someone share the shelter with you. The snow hadn't let up for 3 days. It came in steady whispers like the sky was trying to hush the world below. Elias worked slower in that kind of weather. The fences needed checking, the animals needed feeding, but the days felt heavier now. Not just from the cold, but from the weight of something neither he nor Clara could name. She hadn't spoken much since he helped wrap her ankle. There was a quiet between them, not tense, but expectant. Elias had the feeling they were both waiting for something, even if they couldn't say what it was. He'd caught her standing at the barn door one morning, eyes scanning the road like a hunter expecting something to emerge from the tree line. It came with the mail. A single envelope. No return address. Just his name scribbled like the writer hadn't cared whether it reached him or not. Inside, a torn piece of paper, smudged in places. One line, written in hard, sharp letters, "Woman with a kid, eastbound, worth plenty. Keep watch." Elias stared at it a long time. He didn't need a name. He'd seen the kind of men who wrote messages like that. He'd known them during the war, and he'd seen them again after men who wore civility like a disguise, who used law when violence couldn't finish the job. That night, over stew, he laid the paper on the table in front of Clara. She didn't touch it, just looked at the handwriting. Her face went pale. "Thatcher," she said after a long silence. "It's from him." She didn't have to explain, but she did. Thatcher Roan was her late husband's older brother. After her husband died in a bar fight, Thatcher took control of what was left of their land. Not much, just enough debt and dirt to bury a family. He told her she owed him, told her Rosie was his responsibility now. There was no court, no law that came far enough out to where they lived. Just threats the back of his hand, and a plan she only overheard by accident, sell her and the child to a friend headed west. Labor contracts, they called it. But Clara knew better. She'd seen the girls who never came back. "I took what I could carry and ran," she said, staring into her bowl. "No horse, no money, just the coat off my back and a child in my arms." Elias said nothing. He didn't need to. He got up, went to the shelf, and took down a small rifle. Laid it gently on the table. "You know how to shoot?" Clara looked up. Nodded once. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Elias reinforced the barn door with an extra beam. They checked every latch and hinge on the house. He cleaned all 3 rifles, showed Clara the quickest places to take cover. She moved stiffly, but she moved with purpose. Rosie sensed something too. She stayed close to her mother, quiet but not scared. Elias taught Clara how to shoot from the window. They practiced loading rounds in silence. Clara never missed a target, not once. She didn't tremble, she didn't blink. Whatever fear she had, it had been burned away somewhere down the long, cold road. One morning, a horse came into view. Elias saw it from the edge of the property. One rider dressed in a city coat riding slow and deliberate like he knew he'd be seen. A man built like a fence post, tall and narrow eyes hidden behind dusted spectacles. When he reached the gate, he dismounted, looked straight toward the porch, and tipped his hat. "Elias McCrae, you're looking at him. Name's Mercer. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Thatcher Roan. He's filed a legal petition concerning a runaway woman and a minor child." Elias didn't move. "No one ran here. Nonetheless, he claims you are harboring a woman under labor contract. She is in legal terms his property." Behind Elias, the door creaked. Clara stepped out. Her hair was pulled back, her hands were steady. "You tell him if he wants to sell someone, he'll have to find someone who belongs to him. I don't." Mercer turned to her lips, pressed thin. "You have no documents, no papers, no witnesses. I have scars. Want to see those?" There was silence. Then Mercer spoke again, calm and cold. "We'll return with a warrant." Elias took a step forward. "You come back with anything but the law, and I'll meet you with something older." Mercer nodded once, mounted his horse, and rode away without another word. That night, the air outside seemed sharper, but inside the cabin, Clara didn't tremble. She sat at the table cleaning the rifle. Elias watched her, wondering how many nights she'd done the same, waiting for someone like Thatcher to show up with a rope or a contract. He realized something then. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was preparing to protect this place too. His place, their place. And whatever storm was coming next, they'd face it together, not as strangers, not as fugitives, but as a woman and a man who'd both stopped running. Because when the past rides, and the only way to stand your ground is to know it's worth defending. The snow melted slow that week, as if the land itself was reluctant to reveal what had been buried beneath it. But Clara knew better than to trust the thaw. Some storms didn't end. When the skies cleared, they simply changed shape. The letter arrived, folded in thirds, sealed in wax, and smelling faintly of smoke. Elias opened it at the table, Clara watching with a stillness that said she already knew. Thatcher had filed official papers. The claim was bold and bare unlawful, harboring breach of labor contract and custody over a minor. Clara was to be delivered to Cheyenne for legal arbitration within 7 days. For a long time no one spoke. Rosie, perched on a stool by the window, hummed softly to herself. Her innocence was the only sound. Elias looked across the table. "We don't have to go," but Clara shook her head. "Yes, we do. If I keep running, he wins. If I stay silent, he wins. And Rosie grows up thinking the world has no spine." Elias had seen war-watched men unravel in trenches and on dusty battlefields, but he had never seen courage like that quiet, bleeding mother born. They rode into Cheyenne on a cold morning, just as the sun slipped behind low clouds. The town bustled with winter traders and the sharp clang of blacksmiths. But Clara barely saw it. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead. The courthouse loomed like a barn built of stone and judgment. She held Rosie close. Elias walked beside them, a hand on the rifle strapped to his back, not for show, but for assurance. Inside it smelled of ink, damp paper, and polished wood. The judge was a man with kind eyes but tired hands. Mercer was already there, seated smugly beside a stiff-faced Thatcher Roan. "Mrs. Clara Roan," the judge began, "you are accused of violating a binding contract and removing a minor child from legal guardianship. How do you plead?" Clara stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was calm but sharp. "Not guilty, because I was never property, and neither is my daughter." Gasps rippled through the room. Thatcher leaned forward, lips curled. "You were my brother's wife. You owed the family your labor. I fed you, sheltered you. You ran like a thief." Clara's fingers trembled at her side, but her spine stayed straight. "You hit me, sold everything my husband left me. Tried to trade me to a man in Kansas like cattle. I didn't run like a thief, I ran like a mother." The judge turned to Mercer. "Do you have proof of contract?" Mercer produced a parchment yellowed and creased. The judge read it, then read it again. He frowned. "This contract refers to labor, not guardianship, and it bears no signatures but Mr. Roan's. Mrs. Roan, did you sign this document? Never. Do you have witnesses to corroborate your treatment?" Elias stood. His voice was gravel. "I watched her work from sunup to sundown. I watched her keep a child alive through winter. I offered her shelter, not sanctuary. And I'd do it again." The judge eyed him. "Are you kin?" "No, sir. Just a man who still knows what decency looks like." The courtroom held its breath. Rosie shifted in Clara's arms, then looked up and said softly, "Mama made the cold go away." Something broke open then, not loudly, but deep. The judge leaned back, exhaled. "The law does not uphold the ownership of people, and certainly not the ownership of mothers. The court dismisses this case. Custody remains with the birth mother. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell, and with it, so did the weight Clara had carried for too long. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Not warmer exactly, but freer. Clara held Rosie tighter. Elias stood beside her, unsure of what to say. "It's not over," Clara said quietly. "Not really. There's others like me, women who don't know they have the right to speak." A young woman in a navy coat approached, hand extended. "I'm from the Jackson Hole Women's Shelter. I heard your testimony. Would you come speak at our gathering? Share your story?" Clara blinked. For a second she seemed unsure. Then, slowly, she took the woman's hand. "Maybe it's time I stopped surviving and started helping others do the same." Elias watched her walk away with the stranger Rosie bouncing in her arms. And he felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with pride or relief. It was faith. In her. In what came next. and maybe, just maybe, in himself too. Spring did not arrive with fanfare. It crept into Laramie Hollow like a whisper, softening the edges of winter with the slow, patient warmth of sunlit mornings and thawing earth. The snow receded from the fence posts, revealing the scars of a long, hard season. But for the first time in a long while, Elias McCrae didn't dread what came next. Clara moved more freely now, her limp softened by rest and routine. Rosie grew louder by the day, filling the farmhouse with the sounds of a child rediscovering joy. It wasn't the kind of happiness that shouted or sparkled. It was quieter, a morning laugh, the smell of biscuits, baking, the sight of a red ribbon fluttering from the porch rail. The kind of joy that burrowed in deep and stayed put. The ranch changed little by little. Elias built a small sandbox beside the barn. Clara planted herbs in a row of mismatched pots along the kitchen window. Rosie learned the names of every chicken and insisted they each had distinct personalities. And though Elias said little, he noticed everything. The hum in the air had changed. The silence he'd once cherished now felt too still when they weren't around. One afternoon, Clara sat on the porch steps, wiping her hands on her apron after a long day of kneading bread. Elias leaned against the post, watching the horizon. "I got a letter," she said. He looked at her, waiting. "That woman from Jackson Hole. She wants me to speak again to other women. Says my story gave them courage." Elias nodded slowly. "Will you go?" "I think I should. But I keep wondering, what if Rosie needs a place to grow that doesn't carry shadows? What if I do?" He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the grass, soft and low. "This land, it carries ghosts, but it also keeps what you give it. You've given it warmth again, life. That ain't nothing." She turned to him. "And what if I stay? What does that look like?" Elias smiled just faintly. "It looks like someone choosing something, not because they have to, because they want to." Clara didn't answer then. She just looked out at the fields, at the hills rolling into the horizon, and held Rosie a little closer when she came toddling by with a wildflower in her hand. A few weeks later, the old carriage shed behind the barn was swept clean. Elias installed shelves. Clara filled them with books donated by neighbors and townsfolk. They called it the reading room. Every Saturday, children from nearby farms arrived with dusty boots and eager eyes. Clara read aloud while Rosie passed around cookies. Elias watched from the doorway, arms folded, heart quieter than it had been in years. He began building more than just shelves. Fences were repaired, gates rehung. With Clara's help, he cleared out an old shed and turned it into a hen house. They bought a few more animals. Rosie named every one. Life was no longer just survival. It had rhythm. One morning, Elias found Clara out in the pasture with a sketchbook drawing the mountains. She didn't say a word. But when he brought her coffee, she smiled an open, easy smile that told him she no longer feared tomorrow. That spring, neighbors began stopping by more often. Some brought jam, others seed packets. Clara's quiet strength had stirred something in the community. Folks who once stayed to themselves now offered help and friendship. It wasn't a miracle, it was something better. It was earned. One night, after the last child had gone and the stars had taken their places, Clara found Elias on the porch. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. He turned toward her. "You sure?" She nodded. "I stopped running the day I knocked on your gate. Took me a while to realize it, but I want to build something here, not just survive." He nodded, slowly, deeply. "Then we'll build it." They didn't speak of marriage, not yet, but she began setting 2 cups in the morning without asking. And he made sure the fire never died low at night. Later that week, Rosie drew a picture of their house. In it, she stood between Elias and Clara, holding both their hands. She gave it to Elias without ceremony. He kept it above the mantel. The season rolled forward. Calves were born. Trees budded. Rosie sang her made-up songs to the sky. Clara began teaching letters to children who had never held a book. She spoke again in Jackson Hole, and when she returned, she carried a new purpose in her step. She talked about starting a support group for women across the county. Elias built a bench beneath the big oak tree just for those meetings. One day, while digging rows for spring vegetables, Elias paused, looked over at Clara, and said, "Never figured I'd live through a war just to find peace after it." She smiled, not stopping her work. Sometimes you gotta lose everything to understand what's worth holding on to. And in that quiet corner of the world, a mother, her daughter, and a man who had nearly given up on hope began again. Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't escaping the storm, it's choosing to stay when the sky's finally clear, and knowing deep in your bones that spring is not just a season, it's a beginning. As we look back on the powerful journey of Clara, Elias, and little Rosie, we see a story not just rooted in hardship, but one that blossoms with hope, resilience, and quiet heroism. From the moment Clara fled her cruel past in a blizzard, cradling her child, and her last shred of strength to the day she stood tall in court and claimed back her life, this was a woman who redefined what it means to survive. But Clara did more than survive. She transformed. She walked into Elias's quiet, grief-stricken world and sparked something in him that he thought had died long ago, a reason to build again, to believe again. Together, they turned a cold, empty ranch into a place of warmth, growth, and community. And Rosie, oh Rosie, she went from being a frightened little girl to a joyful spirit who filled their home with laughter and light. Their story reminds us that true strength often hides in stillness. It's in the quiet decisions to stay, to rebuild, to offer a hand when no one is watching. It's in the way Elias repaired fences and opened his heart without asking for anything in return. It's in the way Clara held her daughter and faced down the man who tried to claim her life as property. They didn't set out to become heroes. They just refused to let the worst of the world define them. And in doing so, they found something better than safety. They found purpose. They found each other. So, what can we take away from their story? We live in a world today that's still filled with storms of injustice, of fear, of loneliness. But Clara's journey teaches us that courage doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it's just knocking on a stranger's door. Sometimes it's saying, "I'm not leaving." Her story urges us to believe in second chances, not just for others, but for ourselves. No matter how broken our past may be, no matter how long we've run, we can always choose a new beginning. Elias didn't have to take her in, but when he did, he opened the door, not just to her, but to redemption. That same choice lies in front of each of us every day. Maybe you've been Clara running from something that tried to define you. Or maybe you've been Elias living with ghosts and forgetting how to hope. Or maybe you're like Rosie looking for a safe place to bloom. No matter who you are, this story tells us healing is possible. Kindness matters. And love the kind that's steady and unspoken is still the strongest force on earth. So let's carry their legacy forward. Be someone's safe place. Stand up when others stay silent. And when the storms come, and they always do, remember you've weathered worse. Choose to stay. Choose to build. Choose to believe. If this story touched your heart, if it made you feel seen, or reminded you of what matters most, please consider supporting us by subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more real, raw, and beautiful stories like this one to life. Because here at Wild West Legends, every story is a legend, and every legend starts with someone brave enough to begin again. Subscribe now and ride with us into the next great story.